Welcome to another episode of Brand Retro. Today on the podcast, I want to talk about the power of nostalgia. If you've been listening to this podcast, if you know our brand Cyberdogs and some of the different things that we're doing, we're always talking about nostalgia. One of the questions I got asked recently is whether or not I feel like nostalgia is like a new trend or if it's something that's kind of picking up steam. And the answer for me personally is yes, but I think it's always been there. I think it's just getting more attention. I think it's getting more, a little bit more hype these days because everything is moving so fast. There's AI, there's paid ads, there's just such a digital wave that's happening that's becoming automated, it's becoming AI driven, and people kind of want to come back to the center. They kind of want to come back to who they truly are. And a lot of times that connection or that personal connection, how memories and nostalgia make people feel, it's a very powerful tool. Again, if you've been listening to this podcast, like we've been kind of beating this drum for a long time. I think it's catching on. Yes, I think it's building up steam. I think it's building up momentum, and it is something that most people are now becoming aware of. And when I think of nostalgia, personally, like I'm into classic cars. I love, old movies. I like, basically brands that celebrate nostalgia, from Roots of Fight to Homage to, anything like that is kind of my jam anyway. But at the same time, in branding, in marketing, in business, I think it's important to kind of keep that at the surface and be able to tap into that when necessary. So short answer is yes, I think nostalgia is important. I think it's like I said, it's building up momentum, and I think the steam that is coming off that right now it's relevant to where all this stuff is going from a marketing perspective, and those who are able to tap into it are able to maintain a level of authenticity that I think is powerful in the marketplace. One of the episodes that we have coming up very soon, we have not recorded it yet, but one of the episodes that we have coming up very soon is we're going to sit down and do an episode with Homage Apparel. Homage Apparel is one of the companies I've followed for years, and yeah, they have nice stuff and they have nice quality and all these different things, which is, kind of key in having an apparel brand. But what really caught my eye with them is that just how they leaned into the feeling of it. They have, NBA, they have NFL, they have a variety of pop culture artwork and different things. So like when you look at their product, like I said, the product's great. But when you look at their product, they're also selling you a feeling of nostalgia. They're selling you a feeling of something you can't necessarily get everywhere else, but it goes deep. It's, when you start looking at, some of the retro stuff that they have that goes from DC Comics to, maybe even WWE, you're tapping into something that maybe excited you as a kid, from Hulk Hogan to Batman to, the Chicago Bulls. Like they're tapping into that and they've mastered it. And it's sports nostalgia, it's Midwest culture. It's all of those things wrapped up inside this nostalgic vibe that they have. And that's just one example. Another example of a brand that I follow that I just completely love is Roots of Fight. If you go look at Roots of Fight product, it's all, yeah, again, great quality. It's fits great. It's all the things that an apparel brand needs to have. But they lean into retro WWE. They lean into Bruce Lee. They lean into like pop culture stuff that's coming from the 80s and 90s, and they come up with stuff like this. So this is actually a Roots of Fight sweatshirt. They do a great job branding, tagging, but the vehicle and how we get here, it's retro inspired. It's nostalgia. It's that connection to, something that maybe doesn't exist anymore, or a feeling that you haven't had in a long time. So there's a lot of brands like that out there. And, as I talk about nostalgia and I talk about how to figure that thing out for your brand or how to apply that to your business, you don't have to look very far to find a ton of businesses, apparel brands, or even industries that have kind of figured out a way to apply it. Some more than others, but they apply it nonetheless. Another aspect of nostalgia is being able to tap into what's worked in the past. In marketing, a lot of times, I think it feels better if the idea is fresh and it's new and it's innovative and it's kind of like you're reinventing this wheel. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing or, it's not something we aspire to do from time to time, but I think where we miss opportunity, holistically is that let's look at what works. Let's look at what's worked in the past. I remember when, the whole digital age started happening and social media became a thing, and the industry panicked because it was like billboards are going to die, printing's going to die. All these different traditional methods of marketing were, they were scarcity mindset, but I think they were all kind of on people's radar as like the time and place for those things is over. And I agree that it changed things. I think it shuffled the priority of things, but I definitely think it really only forced those industries, whether it be printing or billboards or whatever, it forced them to rethink. It forced them to adjust, and it forced them to, basically manifest themselves into a different version of themselves. So I think it's the same in that, when you're thinking about nostalgia and you're thinking about the power of and how that works, new ideas are great. And don't get me wrong, that's what pushes things forward. But at the same time, keeping one eye on the past is huge. So if you look at music, if you look at movies, it's all around us. If you think about the apparel, my whole life, people have talked about how apparel, resurfaces itself after 10 to 15 years. And you're seeing that now. Kids are dressing like, maybe like we did in the 80s and 90s from time to time. A lot of young people are going out to thrift stores because they love the idea of finding an old t-shirt from the 90s. And you see the movie remakes that are happening. Everything from Freaky Friday to, even them picking up on franchises that kind of, created the craze from the 80s and 90s. You're seeing it with cars. You're seeing it with, the Mustang Bullet has been redesigned and reimagined now 2 or 3 times from a movie that was, famous in 1968. So this idea of revisiting nostalgia and bringing it forward with a modern twist, it's happening all around us and it's happening all the time. So in marketing and in creativity specifically, you can see those influences coming back. And I don't necessarily feel like it's always like a lazy approach to pull from the past. I think it's genius because people love that. They love the feeling of nostalgia. They love the feeling of relevance and seeing something that emotionally ties back to something they loved back in the day. But at the same time, you're tapping into something that worked. You're tapping into something that already kind of has a pre-established success record on it. So it's huge. And I think brands and companies that are able to kind of ride that line, maybe they have their own legacy that they can tap into from time to time. For those who understand what that looks like and how to leverage it, it's huge. And I think we should always keep one eye on the past. Creatively, I'm always looking at brands from, like I said, from apparel to, different agencies, artists, those who are able to kind of ride that line and modernize nostalgia. They're super attractive to me in the sense that I can see where they're coming from and I can see where they're pulling that influence from. So like when I think about even what we do at CyberDogs, I know we do a lot of, services that don't necessarily tap into that nostalgia, but when we've talked about brand and how to build brand, it's always been about nostalgia. It's always been about finding that authentic place in which to construct it from. I mean, I've seen it in my career, but I think a lot of times when people are creating brand, they're trying to build it for somebody else. They're trying to build a logo or build an identity or build whatever that thing is. They're either trying to build it for somebody else or they're trying to build it to blend into an industry because every other company looks like this. Or like banks is a prime example, financial institutions, they always just want to, let's just look like each other. And that's ridiculous because you don't want to blend in. You want to stand out. And then are you standing out for the sake of standing out, or are you standing out because we have this reason and this backstory and we have this kind of methodology as to why we want to feel or look a certain way. That's the answer that most people miss. And it's because it's kind of a monkey see, monkey do mindset. They don't necessarily know any better. And without somebody to guide them through that thought process, they just end up where they end up. And a lot of times that's looking like everybody else. I'll give you one example, Cracker Barrel. Cracker Barrel attempted to rebrand. It wasn't a crazy rebrand, but they rebranded and they were met with some serious backlash. A lot of opinions from not only their customers, but critics to artists, where everybody just kind of beat them up over the whole deal. And my question around the whole thing was, well, what was broken in the first place? The thing about a good brand, like take a Cracker Barrel, for example. Yeah, it's been that way for a long time. So what? I think the problem is a lot of times just because a brand has been a certain way for a long time, we start to think probably time for a change. We've been this way for this long. We're just due for it. I think the question that needs to be asked is, well, what's broken about what we have? What's not working? I'm not saying rebranding is a bad thing, but you got to really decide whether or not there's something worth fixing. Because if it's working fine the way it is, we should probably start there and figure out if that's really what we want to do, or is it evolving the brand? Are we taking an existing brand and evolving it in a way that maybe adds layers or substance to it, but we're not kind of throwing out the piece that actually got us here? You'll notice this, like if you go look, a lot of brands have been through this. You probably most notably see it in a lot of fast food. Burger King, Taco Bell, McDonald's, they've all gone through brand evolutions where it's like they tried to mimic or evolve their brand into the era that they were in. So they had a look in the 80s that turned into a look in the 90s that turned into, and they've kind of morphed themselves over time. And subliminally, you don't really think about how much it's changed. Like you take a brand like Pepsi, you're like, well, it's always looked the same. Not if you go back and look at it. It's maintained, part of its overall look and feel. So they've been consistent with how they evolved, but they definitely evolved from era to era to try to kind of keep with the times or stay modern, so to speak. Where if you look back, now they're doing the retro thing. They're coming out with the retro cans, or they're I just saw something recently where I think it was Burger King. I can't remember. I should have my facts straight before I talk about this. However, one of the fast foods place was talking about the anniversary of the first Batman film and re-releasing some of the toys and different things that came with the meals that were put out at the time. I can't remember if it was McDonald's or Burger King, but regardless, it's like they're looking back at some of these things, pulling it back out, not only for nostalgia's sake, but they're pulling it out maybe with some awareness that maybe we weren't that far off to begin with. But, over time, you just feel like sometimes you have to evolve to just evolve. And, to be honest, you don't. What does that look like? Can you just stay the same forever? Where, yes, but like I said before, I think you can evolve the subsequent pieces around it. You can add layers. You can tell brand stories that don't necessarily compromise or jeopardize the original look, feel, and purpose of the brand. So like one of the brands that, kind of makes me think of this out of the gate is Nike. So the swoosh itself has always remained the same. The integrity of Nike, the swoosh, they're very tapped into who they are, what they do, and kind of what that whole journey looks like for them from a brand perspective. Now, if you look back from the 70s to the 80s to, all of a sudden it's, bringing in the Michael Jordans and start talking about sub brands and the Bo Jackson era and like everything that from Andre Agassi to Tiger Woods to like, they have had a ridiculous amount, in a good way, but a ridiculous amount of brand evolutions and almost sub-stories that lived within the parent company, which was Nike, the swoosh. the culture behind Nike, the why, for Nike as far as how they signed athletes and how they pushed their message forward. That didn't change. They didn't disrupt the core of their business. They just added layers. So again, like, if you're thinking about nostalgia, how does this play into my brand? There's a lot of ways you can do it, but it's really thinking deeper than that, and study other brands. Look at some of these other brands who maybe they evolved too much, or they evolved too soon, or they didn't evolve enough. But get a sense of, kind of what that looks like and the tactics that are being used. And I guarantee there's something in there for everybody. There's something in there for every brand to attach this mindset or adopt this vision or this mindset to their brand, to their company. One piece of advice I have for companies and brands, as you're thinking about this idea of nostalgia, how to tap into it, what does that look like for me? Look no further than probably the things that excite you. Typically, when you look at those things that excite you, the parts that connect to you, you're gonna find camaraderie in the brands and the different things that you like to follow, which is kind of a stepping stone to kind of lean into the part, well, maybe I could make that work for my brand, or maybe I could, and don't overthink it. I have clients that, maybe they're in the finance industry or whatever, and they're thinking, well, I'm not sure that applies to me. And it's like, well, it certainly could. You could find a retro style sweatshirt, which you put your logo on, and maybe you're dipping your toes into nostalgia is your merch strategy. Or maybe it's looking back at it's a styling or a design aesthetic that maybe we bring some of that forward in how we position your brand look and feel, or your annual reports or whatever it is. So don't overcomplicate it. Look at the things that appeal to you, and then we can kind of deconstruct it from there and try to figure out how to, and it doesn't have to be overwhelming. It's subtle. It's grabbing those little cues and those little things that might motivate or energize you to kind of feel that feeling of nostalgia, and then continue to build on it from there. Because the point is if it starts with you, you're going to get that feeling, you're going to get excited about it, and you're going to be able to kind of represent that and speak to it in an authentic way that then transcends into the client's experience. So that's my advice, is like, look no further than yourself to what things do you like? What if you think about this idea of nostalgia and authenticity and kind of really thinking about how all this works, what excites you? What are those 2 or 3 or 4 things that, if I think back to my past and what kind of got me into this industry and what kind of things interest me, what are those things, and start there. If you spend any time online kind of looking around, you'll see this. It's not a trend, but it's a conversation that's building up momentum around the idea of nostalgia and it being a tactic and whatnot. And again, I've said this about 50 times here, but sure, I think it is. I think it's important, and I think for a good brand, I think it's a very powerful element to have baked into your brand. But one of the questions, like I got asked in prep for this episode, is whether or not I feel it's one of the safest forms of marketing and whatnot, or what my thoughts were around that. And I guess how I would answer that is, I don't know if it's the safe play. It's because it's got to be right. The thing is I think it's a powerful tool. And I think if you can find your individual recipe and how you apply it, how you leverage it, then absolutely, I think you should do it. But I don't think you should force it. I think you shouldn't, I don't think you should adopt somebody else's method or somebody else's recipe and try to wedge it in just for the sake of saying, hey, we have this nostalgia thing going on. I think it's got to be right. And when it is right, then I think it is safe, because it's authentic. It's real to you. It is, for whatever reason, it's going to be special for you, and you're going to feel energized about it. So when you talk about your brand, you talk about your business, it's going to be obvious to people that it's real, and I think that's where that security or that safety lives. It's not just about adopting the tactic, because if it's not right, it's not right. So my challenge to you guys is to go out there and, let me start with, if the whole nostalgic vibe is not your thing, then I hope you enjoyed the episode. If the nostalgic thing is your vibe, I would challenge you to go out there and do a little homework and kind of think through what aspects of that could potentially apply to you, your brand. What does that look like? And again, I'm open to have the conversation. Find me on LinkedIn, comment below, smash that subscribe button, whatever it is. But let's figure out how to do it. Reach out to me. I'd love to chat with you about it. This is one of those episodes, and it's a topic that's kind of near and dear to my heart. But it's an offering up thing of if you need help or you want to have that conversation, I'd love to have it.